When I think about my biggest barriers to addressing violence, whether that be direct, structural, or cultural, I think of a quote, and I'm going to read it from Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, an incredible Indigenous author and scientist. I highly recommend this book. And the quote reads, in the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. And so I just want to pause here. In the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything. Identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. So what Robin does here so beautifully is she illustrates two worldviews and consequential relationships, in this case to Earth. She explains in The Settler and in what is currently Canada and also the United States, when we say settler, we're referring to people who belong to the colonizing nations of these places. In the settler mind, we see Earth as something to be extracted from, as something to be owned and profited from, as a thing rather than something we're in relationship with. Now that leads to a consequential relationship to Earth, arguably one that has led us to the climate crisis that we are currently in now, and overconsumption and environmental degradation and extraction. Now, in the second part of that quote, but to our people, it was everything. Identity, connection to our ancestors, home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. We see Earth as an extension of self, as being a being that has inherent rights and that we are in relationship with and therefore have a responsibility to. Now, this shapes a very different kind of relationship to Earth. It's a completely different worldview. Now, what happens in so many spaces that is structurally and culturally supported, and often directly in terms of violence, direct violence is used to reinforce the fact that one worldview is going to be positioned as the one that is true and legitimate. And we see that reinforced through many of our policies, our laws, how many states are governed. And we see that enforced through often violence of policing, violence against land protectors. We often see that through very direct violence, the reinforcement of the legitimacy and superiority of that worldview. In comparison to the other worldview, which is no less true, but is positioned in a hierarchy where it is too spiritual, not legitimate, at best, nice to have if it reinforces the superior worldview. And again, this hierarchy is reinforced through the structural violence we often see in education, in media, in news media, in consumer media. And so when we think of these hierarchies, when I think of my biggest barriers to addressing violence, it comes down to an ignorance to what's happening at a worldview level, an ignorance to what's happening to some people's truths and other people's truths. And this is all rooted in a very intentional history. This is all by design. If we look at so many places around the world, if we look at colonized states, for example, what is currently Canada, we were colonized for gold, God, and glory, for profit, for spreading religion, and for power. Now, a way that that was achieved and what reinforced and informed why what is currently Canada was colonized was resource extraction and control. And the systems that were created in what is currently Canada, the RCMP, our government, our education system, our legal institutions, were all created at their foundation to facilitate the extraction and control of natural resources. And the culture that emerged from and informing these structural entities sought to ideologically reinforce and facilitate that mission, sought to create and validate worldviews that validate that mission. And so when we look at residential schools, when we look at the worldview that led to residential schools, and these were schools that Indigenous people in what is currently Canada were forced to go into, and where we experienced cultural and direct genocide, where we're still uncovering unmarked graves of children in our families. When we think of those institutions, the cultural worldview that informed those institutions was that Indigenous people need to be eradicated. Indigenous people need to be assimilated into the general society. Now, that was a necessity in addressing the threat that Indigenous people play in accessing our lands for natural resource extraction and control. Our rights and our identities and our histories that are reinforced through treaties, those are all a threat to that mission of resource extraction and control. Now, this is all so historically rooted, and it plays out in so many ways in our contemporary realities today. And the better we're able to understand this, and the better we're able to make those connections, the better position we are in to recognize how our truths and the worldviews that we carry have been shaped by that history. Why I look at a scientist with more authority than an elder. That is a direct legacy of so many of these racist missions. missions that have and are at the foundation of why we need to do peace building work in the first place, climate justice work in the first place. And so my biggest barrier to addressing the violence that we witness and contribute to, oftentimes unknowingly, is an ignorance to the historical roots of our worldviews and how they play out today.